So welcome again to the Crediton Area History Zoom presentation series, hosted by us at Crediton Library, but organised by the fine people who make up the Crediton and surrounding area local history groups. We are joined today, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Simon Dell MBE, who will be... Hi, Simon. Simon will be talking to us about Lundy Island and the history thereof. Simon is a retired police officer who earned his MBE for both services to community policing and to the Dartmoor Rescue Service, I think I'm right in saying, and is a speaker who is in great demand around the county for his talks both on Lundy and on Dartmoor, and also on policing and various aspects of that too. But today we are concentrating on the small island off the North Devon coast of Lundy. And to find out exactly what we are going to learn about that, I shall now pass over to today's speaker, Simon Dell. Simon, thank you very much for coming, and it's over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. That's very kind of you. And thanks for that very generous introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me along to give you a talk about Lundy Island. I was asked if I could do this one in particular, which is one of a number of talks I do about Lundy, because Lundy has recently celebrated its landmark 50 years. And that's the title of the book, which I wrote about Lundy Island in 2019. It seems like yesterday, doesn't it? And in 2019, we commemorated 50 years of Lundy being in the ownership of the National Trust, leased to the Landmark Trust since 1969. And I'll just make sure that I can push the first slide on, because sometimes it does get a bit jammed up. There we are. That's what I want to do. Force it on. There we are. And I am one of the 12 Lundy ambassadors on the island. And as Mark explained, it's 10 miles off the North Devon coast, off Bideford and Hartland Point. And Lundy Island is now owned by the National Trust and has been in the ownership of the National Trust since 1969. So how did it come by being in the ownership of the National Trust, and for what reason? It's actually quite an interesting story from 1969 until the current day. Talk about Lundy Island was going back a little bit of history, of course. In historical times, going over several hundred years, of course, the island was always owned by the sovereign, the king or the queen at that time, unless, of course, it was in the hands of pirates. And also all sorts of naughty goings on went over in the Bristol Channel, in the entrance to one of the biggest shipping lanes in Britain. In 1836, Mr. William Hudson Heaven purchased Lundy Island, and he built an hotel there, as you can see in this image. When he passed away, his son, Grosset Hudson Heaven, what a cracking name. Grosset Hudson Heaven wanted to become ordained, and so he went to theological college and became the Reverend Heaven. I rather like that. And he built the church to the left of this picture, St. Helen's Church. His lifetime's ambition was to have a church on Lundy to the glory of God. And so he built that church in 1897. It was consecrated by the Bishop of Crediton. And the bishop went across to Lundy Island in a rather small sailing boat on a journey which should have taken about 2 hours, but it actually took 5 hours. Could you imagine the tempestuous, awful trip that the bishop had? When he arrived on Lundy Island after the most ghastly journey, he declared that he had travelled through the gates of hell to arrive at the kingdom of heaven, and that name has stuck. Heaven, back in the 1860s, had this stores and tavern constructed for the men who worked on Lundy, who were the quarry workers in the 1860s. And of course, this image here, early 20th century, is a very similar image to today's tavern. The 1920s, the last owners of Lundy Island purchased it. It was the Harman family. And here we have Mr. Martin Coles Harman. In 1924, he decided he would buy Lundy Island as a retreat, as a holiday home. It wasn't as a main permanent residence. And so he and his family owned Lundy Island. And it was owned by his family right up until 1969, when it was handed over to the National Trust. Mr. Harman owned Lundy during those Second World War arduous years of austerity, and years where the finances of Lundy Island really diminished very significantly. In fact, to be honest, this is quite a good example of what Lundy was a bit like in the 1950s, the 1960s. During that time, post Second World War, they really did need a significant cash injection, but it wasn't there. When Mr. Harman came to Lundy Island in the 1920s, he brought with him this gentleman here, Mr. Gade, Felix Gade, the man who I was introduced to when I was a 9-year-old schoolboy at Appledore up in North Devon on the banks of the Torridge. And when I arrived on Lundy Island in that 1960s period when it was still owned, the last few years of it being owned by the Harman family, my dear teacher, Miss Batts, she introduced me to this gentleman and she said, "Simon, this is the King of Lundy." And it was Mr. Gade. When I was 9 years old, I just about met the belt on his trousers. He was a man who was well over 6 foot tall, sort of 6'5", 6'6", a very tall man. But he really did impress me. He was the land agent for the Harman family from 1925 until 1969. That's not bad, is it? Over 50 years worth of living on Lundy Island. What was remarkable is that he wrote his memoirs and he lived there pretty much throughout those entire years with his wife, Irene. So he was a man who really played a part in my formative years of falling in love with Lundy Island. Over on the left here, bend over with the suit, is Mr. Harman himself. They are pointing, his son, Albion Harman, with his 2 children, are pointing at a memorial. That memorial is a memorial to Mr. Harman's other son. In the picture, there is Mr. Albion Harman in the white shirt. Mr. Albion Harman's older brother, John Pennington Harman, was killed at the Battle of Kohima on Easter Sunday in 1944. And this is a memorial which is in what we now call VC Quarry, Victoria Cross Quarry, because John Pennington Harman was a very brave man who was, alas, awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. And so on the 5th anniversary of his son's death, Mr. Harman on the left here had this plaque unveiled in memory of a very brave young man. And Mr. Harman, Senior, on the left there, passed away in 1954. It was his son, Albion, pictured there in the middle of the group, who inherited Lundy Island, along with his 2 sisters, of course. And his 2 sisters, Diana and Ruth. Diana here on the left there with the red check skirt, smiling delightfully at her brother-in-law, Mr. Jones. And then over to the right in the blue suit is her sister, Ruth Jones. I gave this talk at the U3A group at Sidmouth last Tuesday afternoon. And I found out on Tuesday night that Diana, pictured here on the left, who celebrated her 99th birthday in September this year, passed away. So that was a sad news of a dear friend of mine, dear Diana. I always referred to her as the Queen Mother of Lundy. Her sister died some years ago, and her brother-in-law Peter there died as well. But we were really hoping Diana might have been there for her 100th, but not to be. And she's now gone on to higher service. So God rest her soul. Those 3 siblings took over the island from their father in 1954. Things were very, very tough, and times were going to get tougher. Income was very difficult. Post-war years, the 1950s into the 1960s, did still see income from holidaymakers staying in the tavern and the Manor House Hotel, but tragedy struck. Here we have in the background there Mr. Albion Harman, the son of Martin Coles Harman. In 1968, Mr. Albion Harman here died really cruelly, very young, in his 50s, leaving his wife, Kate, here in the foreground. And actually, by coincidence, she almost made 100 herself, the same as her sister-in-law, Diana. So when he died in 1968, his widow, Kathleen, known as Kate, along with Ruth and also Mrs. Jones and also Diana, were left to run the island. Were they going to sell it? Were they going to carry on with it? They had a very difficult decision. I guess this might have been perhaps the last photograph ever taken of Albion Harman in 1968, walking with his sister Diana down to the slipway to go and get a boat to return home. And those three ladies were faced with a very difficult decision. They would give it a go. They would keep the island. They would try to manage it. They would try to keep it going. They would still have holiday makers and day trippers. And here's an image there, which really does conjure up some wonderful childhood memories for me. That really rough, steep path coming up from the little tiny stone slipway on the beach there, below the South Light. This image here, I guess, was probably taken in the 1960s, around that time when I, as a schoolboy, was visiting London. Used to go across there, and I'm sure some of you in the audience today, and lovely to know that everybody's joining me here for the talk. I bet some of you have been across the Lundy Island in that period. We used to get rowed across, or in the little jetty, to come across from the Oldenburg or the Balmoral or Waverley, or years ago, the Westward Ho. And you'd be dropped off on this little platform there and then walk across onto the island. It used to take hours. When the Landmark Trust arrived, of course, they had their own little vessel. Before they arrived, the Lundy Gannet was plying its trade between Lundy and the mainland, usually into Bideford port, into the harbour there. And the Lundy Gannet was from up north, so retained its H registration number, H57. I rather like that. And so that little boat there plied its trade between Lundy and... In 1968, of course, Lundy was not the Lundy of today. Lundy of today is a vibrant, very busy community with wonderfully restored buildings. In 1968, this is what it pretty much looked like, with the Manor House Hotel there, with the wall in front of it. To the left, the black shed, and then, well, I think this picture could just as well be entitled Work in Progress. It really was quite a rundown island. Of course, was, well, a little lackluster, shall I say. And the castle itself as well. Now you can stay in the castle in three little cottages. Well, that was, as you can see, a very rundown indeed. So in 1968, the ladies were faced with a difficult decision. I think they took a brave decision in keeping the island going. But the following year, in 1969, the unthinkable happened, and the main road on Lundy Island collapsed and subsided. A great landslip occurred, and a 60 to 70 foot stretch of the road collapsed. When you look at this image here, can you see those two little old derelict fishermen's cottages there on the road going up the hill? It was a huge collapse in that area there. And as you can see, it's a very steep road. It needs a lot of maintenance to it. Way over to the left, you'll see that in the 1950s, a lot of concrete was used in trying to shore up that road. But where the little white cottage, Seaview Cottage, is located there, that's where it collapsed, and the whole lot fell away. Well, without a road, you've got no Lundy Island. You have no commerce, you have no trade, you have no income. And so they were faced with an incredibly difficult day. Here we have an image taken from the deck of the Lundy Gannet. And you can see the little blue cob, the blue boat there in the distance with the mast pointing up towards the little Seaview Cottage, just over to the right-hand side there. You've got the evidence of the landslip. This is a photograph taken after the repairs that were conducted the following years. They took a difficult decision. There's no way they could have afforded to repair that road. So, folks, they gave it a year, you know, they tried hard, but there's no way they could financially manage Lundy Island. And so they decided to put it up for sale. And it had a price on its head, of course, of in excess of £100,000. Could you imagine buying Lundy Island now for £100,000? In 1969, negotiations were in hand to sell the island. There were a number of people who were interested in the island, and so a marketing brochure was created, which is a wonderful social document of Lundy Island in 1969. The auctioneers from Barnstable, Price, Ogden and Stubbs took on, and it's a really thick, substantial document looking at every single building on the island. They had an offer and interest from the Church of Scientology, and they were going to put a bid in on Lundy Island. And two of their pastors came across to Lundy, and here they are pictured in front of the Morisco Tavern with the church in the background there. And they were very interested in creating an ecumenical retreat, for want of a better word, on Lundy Island. There was also a group of Manchester casino owners who wanted to buy Lundy Island. Could you imagine it? This is when Mr. Thorpe came into the equation. Jeremy Thorpe was our MP in North Devon at that time. He was the leader of the Liberal Party. He was a friend of my dad's because Dad was a Liberal councillor as well. And Mr. Thorpe, along with some other members of Parliament, here is Sir Peter Mills there, and Lady Mills, looks like they're judging something or other at a WI fete by the look of it. And also, of course, Dr. David Owen, another member of Parliament, all three of them from different parties. They set their party politics aside, which I think is very noble of them. But they were all the local Devon members of Parliament. And they were very concerned about Lundy Island. Was it going to be sold to the right people? Was it the right organisation? Do we need to look at the future of Lundy Island? Well, while all the negotiations of sales and the auction were being prepared, they made an approach. The gentleman here on the left with his hands in his pockets, that is John Smith, later Sir John Smith. John Smith had at one time been a member of Parliament for Westminster in central London. And Mr. Smith was a banker. He was a very astute businessman. And a few years previously, I think in 1965, he had created a charity. At one time been a trustee of the National Trust, but had then left that in order to set up his own charity, the Landmark Trust. The Landmark Trust had not identical aims and objectives as the National Trust. You wouldn't be able to do that. But the aims and objectives of the Landmark Trust is to seek out and obtain old historic buildings which are in need of TLC, in need of rebuilding, in order that they could be let out for holidays for people to rent. And so that is what the Landmark Trust's sort of objectives were and still are today. So they approached Mr. Smith and inquired of him and said, if we manage to sell Lundy Island and get it donated to the National Trust, would the Landmark Trust be willing to lease it and take on the responsibility? Because the National Trust had been approached and the National Trust said, no, thank you, because we must have an endowment to ensure the future of Lundy Island. And there was no endowment. And so if John Smith agreed to lease it, then there's a hope. But we need to find somebody who would be willing to buy it and donate it. That's when Sir John Smith approached the gentleman on the right here with the spectacles, Jack Hayward, Sir Jack Hayward, later on. You might remember Jack Hayward as owning Wolverhampton Wanderers Football Club. And Mr. Hayward lived in the Bahamas, and he was approached. He loved islands, although he had never been to Lundy Island. And they inquired of him, and he said, if I can buy it, I will be willing to donate it to the National Trust. There we are. The deal is set. And so the game's afoot, as Shakespeare would want to say. And he agreed he will go to the auction and bid for Lundy Island. Went ahead at the Queen's Hotel in Barnstable. When it got to £140,000, the gavel was about to fall, and any more bids, ladies and gentlemen, going once, going twice, and £150,000 was bid by Mr. Jack Hayward, sold to Mr. Jack Hayward, and he purchased Lundy Island. He then immediately donated it to the National Trust, who immediately leased it to the Landmark Trust, who had already created a little company within its charitable status called the Lundy Company. And now, or then, and indeed now, the Lundy Company run Lundy Island. And so here we have a 1969 North Devon Journal Herald article there about Lundy having. The resident artist on Lundy Island was a dear man called John Dyke, and he provided in July 1969, at the time of the sale, this lovely illuminated scroll, this vellum scroll, signed by all the people who were on Lundy Island at that time of the sale of the island to Jack Hayward, and the donation and saving it for the nation, the National Trust. On the 28th of September 1969, church service was held. 1,000 people came across on boats, the two big boats and lots of other small ones, on that day. On the 28th of September 2019, I again went to that church service in order to commemorate the 50 years of the ownership of the National Trust. In the 1960s, the National Trust then took a step backwards to allow the Landmark Trust to now start sorting out Lundy Island. I do hope, folks, you haven't forgotten that road. That's still in pieces down the bottom of the hill. And work had to commence very quickly to start restoring the road to get communication and people over onto the island. We have a photograph here, and there sitting is dear Mr. Gade in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and he is sitting next to his wife on his left. She was simply known as Cheerful. She was a very diminutive little lady, unlike Mr. Gade, who was well over 6 foot. And just shortly after this photograph was taken, dear Mrs. Gade passed away. And so to work. The Landmark Trust now lease Lundy Island, and they, I guess, if this happened in 2021, we would have ships, we would have concrete being pumped, we'd have helicopters, we'd have all sorts of support and infrastructure. In those days, it was a different matter entirely. Here is a very rough looking road, just filled in slightly to try to get a degree of access going up the hill. Of that concrete mixer and 3 men working on it for weeks at a time, poured concrete and shoveled it down the hill into the bottom of the cliffs in order to provide sea defense, and they're still standing now, a real testament to those 1960s labourers. And a photograph of Seaview Cottage there, the little derelict white building. Just to the right of it, there's that chute going down to the sea defences. And this photograph was taken just after the completion of the restoration of the road. You can see the new virginal soil and rocks on the side having been passed down there. So we've now got the road open again. And now business as usual, and the Land Rovers can get down to the jetty and the tractor can get down to the jetty. And tourists and holidaymakers could come across, day trippers could come across on the boats. And we now have the Landmark Trust in charge and doing work of great good. Do you know, when you're renovating an island, you really do need a big ship to be able to take across stores and goods, prefabricated wooden buildings. And the dear little Lundy Gannet was certainly not capable of carrying that sort of cargo. They looked all around Europe. And all around Europe, they found this ship, the Adgleo, over in Denmark. And the Adgleo was an ice-breaking vehicle which used to ply its trade from Denmark around out towards the Faroe Islands, which are part of the Denmark country, and of course Greenland as well, which again is an extension of Denmark. And so this vessel was purchased because you could have 12 passengers on board. It had a big winch, a big derrick crane on board, and it had a very shallow draft because the harbour at Bideford goes through and out over Bideford and Barnstaple Bar, the sandbanks. So the Adglao was purchased and repainted red and renamed the Polar Bear. And here she is in Ilfracombe Harbour, next door to the very diminutive-looking Lundy Gannet in the 1960s, early 1970s, probably. Of course, when the Polar Bear was moored up in the bay, the landing bay, they needed a vessel to be able to go back and forward from the beach, the landing beach, to go and unload it. And the engineer on the island, a man by the name of Sheeran, Mr. Sheeran, he decided he would make an amphibious vehicle, a vehicle that could be winched up the beach on wheels, but was capable of carrying a lot of capacity. And so he built this amphibious looking vehicle, which would be winched up the beach, up the little slipway. There is the boat. And they thought, well, what shall we call it? All little vessels need to be named. And they decided they would call it after its builder. And it was simply called the Sheeran. The Sheeran, you'll be delighted to know, is still plying its trade, not on Lundy, but it is robust enough, and it was a good little workhorse and still is, and it's working around the Isle of Dogs over east of the Thames. So a very important commodity, because when the vessels were going over there, they needed unloading, and the Sheeran did that job. Here we have a photograph taken on the deck of the Lundy Gannet, and the accommodation for day trippers was a little, well, how can I put it politely? Primitive. And they would sit on the beer barrels or sit on the deck or on boxes on their journey across to Lundy Island, which sometimes could be a little tempestuous. Arrived at Lundy Island, there was the hotel, of course, in the late 60s, early 1970s. You were given a key to your room along with a bucket under the drips from the ceiling because the hotel was leaking like a sieve. A little later on, after a few years, of course, the Polar Bear was really working hard, and the little Lundy Gannet was no longer required, and so she was sold. And here is a photograph of them both just passing each other as the Polar Bear is going into Ilfracombe Harbour and the little Lundy Gannet is leaving on her voyage up towards Liverpool, where she still lives up there working around that area. The first building to be replaced was this one. This is Brambles. And this is a building which actually was constructed at the time of Mr. William Hudson Heaven in the 19th century. And it was riddled with deathwatch, beetle and dry rot. And that had to go. And it had to be replaced. And so the Polar Bear brought across a new Brambles building built on the mainland in kit form. So this one had to be demolished. And he's the tractor driver down the bottom there on his little Fordson. It took him about 15 minutes to pull it down. It was so rotted, but it took him about 2 hours to knock down the chimney pot with a sledgehammer. And here we have the deck of the Polar Bear, looking up at Lundy Island. You can see high up there on the left, Ilcombe House looking very grey. It's lovely painted white now. And that's where Mr. Heaven lived in the 19th century. And on the deck here, the guy looking to the right with the white shirt and the blue overalls there is Bob Bendel, the first mate of the Polar Bear. And on the left there, I think that looks like roof truss material for the Brambles building. And there is the new Brambles. I did hear last week, only as recent as last week, there was a newspaper cutting which somebody had found from North Devon in the 1970s, and the council at that time were very critical of the Landmark Trust, who had failed to apply for planning permission to build this wooden prefabricated building, and they are in the expectant hope that they will toe the line in future, and so therefore retrospective planning permission was. Have a photograph, work in progress, of course. It was decided that a lot more accommodation was needed for the staff, for the workers who were now going to be completely rebuilding Lundy Island. And in the middle of this photograph, can you see a big rough field behind the buildings there with, it looks like 2 chicken coops in the field there. Quarters, prefabricated, pre-built on the mainland in sectional. They were built there as temporary accommodation for staff and the builders. And whenever historically you have prefabs, they last forever, don't they? And they are still there. in good condition and well maintained staff for the people who live on the island. Right behind quarters, the new prefabs, is today's camping field. But look behind today's camping field and you can see the tents lined up along the wall there. I suspect there may have been some westerly winds blowing that day and everyone's hunkering down behind the east-facing side of them. I mentioned that Mrs. Gade passed away in the early 1970s, and here is her coffin being carried to a tractor and trailer to be taken down to the landing stage, to be taken across to Bideford for her funeral service. Her body was returned to the island and was interred on the island. It was decided that a number of buildings did have to go. When you look at this shot here of the village, look up high, oh, you can see the North Devon coast, way, way, way in the distance. That's the area of Hartland Point. Look over towards the left and way in the distance on Lundy Island itself, you can see some cottages there that Mr. Smith decided that they had to go to be razed to the ground because they are hiding the castle. And he wanted the castle to be restored as the preeminent building on the island. Cottages on the left are the old Coast Guard cottages, which have been derelict since the Second World War years. And also over on the right, the signal cottages, which were still actually being lived in. And my friend Reg Lavelle, with a JCB, he knocked them down. He said it didn't take them very long at all. But when they were razed to the ground, all the material was either burned or crushed for ballast, for building material. And in the distance there on the right is the castle, which was going to be restored, reclaimed and revitalized into accommodation for visitors, into 3 cottages. Mason came over from the mainland and started working with a little team, and the village, of course, was still in need of a bit of TLC, as you can see, but visitors and day trippers, bird watchers were still coming over on, and work did commence. Looking on the left there, the big building, the Linné, looks like the walls have been plastered inside by the look of it. There's the old Fordson tractor on the right-hand side, a real old throwback to the Second World War years when it arrived on Lundy in crates and was constructed and built by the engineer on the island at that time, Dave Davey. And he filled it up with oil, put fuel in it, got it sorted and turned the engine and it started first time. Well done, Dave Davey. Here we've got even more work in progress. A lot of building materials over there on the left-hand side. You can see a few walls have been taken down, and the centre of the village, the hotel, has changed significantly into a number of buildings. The Linné was pretty much derelict, and that was seen to. And the back of the pub, the tavern, really did need a lot of work there, of course. And that whole project was going on during those wonderful summers of the 1969-70 period. And here we have the remains of the corner of the old hotel having been knocked down, and the Old House North and Old House South now being constructed. You can pretty much say they're brand new buildings in a way, really. But they kept their character of the old hotel. If you put a building in the corner here, you've got pretty much the old footprint of the hotel, of the manor house. In that area, of course, was the tavern, and still is. And here we have the tavern being built. And in 1987, Her Majesty the Queen visited the island 8 years after it was taken over by the Landmark Trust, owned by the National Trust. And here is Sir John Smith with Her Majesty just walking down the slipway back to her journey back onto the Royal Yacht Britannia there, and with a Royal Naval vessel in protection on the other side of it. 1974, dear old Mr. Gade passed away as a venerable gentleman, and he wished to be buried on the island, and his wish was granted, of course it was. And so he now shares a plot up in the area, the Beacon Hill Cemetery, which dates back to prehistoric times. There are Bronze Age burials even in that area. And so all the burials take place up in that area next door to the old light. The barn was going to be converted into a museum, but that never happened. The barn was actually converted and is now a hostel for groups, school groups, university groups, big social groups. I think it sleeps about a great big fireplace in the on Lundy Island. Lundy Island is owned freehold by the National Trust, but not all of the island. There are 3 places on the island which are not owned by the National Trust. This is the North Light. The North Light was and still is owned freehold by the Trinity House Corporation. The North Light had a big gantry and a derrick there. That's pictured in the 1960s, and there was a great winch which went down to the sea level, where the lighthouse keepers would winch up their goods and would take them to the North Light. As we walk back further towards the south, there's this building here. It was an old First World War military admiralty lookout, but is still for rent if you want. It's a bit posher than this. This photograph, I think, was taken in the early 1970s. And the building on the left there, the wooden building, is the kitchen of the building in those days. The lighthouse I did briefly mention being near the cemetery. This building was the headquarters of the Lundy Field Society from 1954 onwards. And here we see the gantry and the scaffolding. I take my hat off to the scaffolders who put that lot up, restoring the gallery of the old light. And now it is in a wonderful condition. And the old light, you can see me there with a school group a few years ago. And the old light now is for rent for holidays. On the right-hand side of the old light, you've got old light upper, and behind the wall, old light lower. Those were the cottages which were lived in by the lighthouse keepers. The lighthouse itself was constructed by a man called Daniel Alexander in 1819, 10 years after he built Dartmoor Prison. He was a Plymouth architect. The foreground there, we have a Land Rover and also the old generator, the wind generator. That eventually blew down in a great hurricane some years ago. But there are aspirations to continue to have green energy, of course, with solar power and wind power. At the moment, it's diesel powered, but they're working hard on looking at really making their mark when it comes to the environment. Supply in the 1970s was done by boreholes and still is, and these are the water storage. And here's a photograph from the 1970s of them, just by the look of it, being completed. And water is still held in those tanks. It's now gone through a much more modern and effective water purification system and comes out of the taps as drinkable as the taps in your house on mainland Devon. Down on the south of the island, there's the old lighthouse, there's the South Light. And again, you can see the winch cable there on the right-hand side, which picked goods up from the Trinity House vessels in the bay and winched them up onto the lighthouse area. When you look back at that lighthouse, look on the right-hand side, there's the cliffs going up to the castle. This picture was obviously taken around the 1970s, I should think 1980s, because the cottages are still up there. They haven't yet been pulled down by the look of it. There is the lovely pictures of the rhododendrons. The rhododendrons on Lundy really were beautiful, I must admit, but they're quite poisonous. And the unique indigenous Lundy cabbage plant was really being affected by them. So a very brave decision was taken to eradicate the rhododendron bushes. The church has had a checkered history of maintenance, and it really did suffer in the 1950s, the 1960s. The east window there above the altar blew in, and a breeze block window was put up to keep the weather out. In danger of falling out of the belfry because the wood was rotting away, and so a lot of work was needed. And that work was funded by the Lottery Fund and also other funding sources as well. And so over a number of years, fairly recently, just prior to lockdown, the scaffolding was put up and a great deal of work was done to restore the east wind tracery, the lovely limestone. And young Matt here was an apprentice on that job. And I said to him while he was building it, after I took this photograph, I said to you, when you finish this job, Matt, what are you up to? He said, oh, I'm going on to my next job. I said, oh, that's great. You're really taken to this. He said, yeah, I'm starting another job on a big church. I said, oh, what's it called? And he said, oh, it's a place in London. It's called Westminster Cathedral. And so he's still working on Westminster Cathedral, which is cracking, isn't it? And so there we have work in progress inside the church, which importantly has retained an ecumenical use and also an educational use as well. And so now it's open to the public and really is an absolute credit. When stores are taken over to Lundy Island, stores on foot with horses, the cattle and the sheep brought across in the army vessels, the amphibious, and they helped out significantly. And New Zealand come across still every year to shear the sheep, the commercial sheep, the Texels cross. They are on Lundy. The building to be constructed on Lundy Island as a new build was this building, which became known as Government House. It was originally built for the residence of the land agent, but the land agent said this is far too grand, and it was then rented out, and still is rented out for holidays for people. The staff are accommodated as well on the island, of course. There are 27 staff that live there. And this is the conversion in the 1970s of some of the old sheds at the back of Milcombe House into residents and workers and the wardens' accommodation. And so while all this is going on, and the Landmark Trust is still working hard to keep the island going, there's the Lundy Gannet in the background, obviously not yet left yet. And there's one of the amphibious warfare squadron vehicles from Fremington Army Camp there at Instow. And they used to bring out all the big stock and the vehicles. And this is how they used to get cattle onto the island. Just simply take them on a cattle lorry and open the back and drive them up the road. Talking of roads, it was decided that really what they really needed was a jetty, and a big landing jetty at that. And so it was decided to dig a road under the cliffs around to the little landing bay, and that road took 10 years to build under the side of the South Light. And you can see there by the telegraph pole how the geology of the island is not best suited to have a road built around the side of it, and it really collapses. And so it was a geologist's nightmare. But it took 10 years to build it to go around the corner. While they were doing that, it was decided that Lundy Island really did need a new vessel. The Polar Bear had had its day. It could take 12 people across, but really it was needed to be retired. The work had been done, and we now needed a big tourism vessel. This vessel was found in Germany, the Oldenburg, the MS Oldenburg. MS stands for Motorschiffen. It was owned at one time by the German railway company, and it was found in Germany, and it used to ply its trade off the north coast of Germany around the Helgoland Island and the Frisian Islands, and it came to Lundy Island, and here she is moored up in the approximate location of where the new jetty was constructed in the year 1999. And in those days, of course, the main road was still subject to landslides, and this was a landslide, which is very common, and it occurred on a sailing day. Wing shovel down from the island to open up the road very quickly because tourists were coming. Very misty morning, I was told. And that great big lump had to be removed, and the swing shovel chucked it over the cliffs, just as, and the sun came out, and nobody noticed a thing, I don't think. And they brought down that bit of wood to be able to put across the top of it so people could get up to the island. The construction started in the 1990s of the landing jetty for Lundy Island. And the landing jetty was constructed, and at the top of the jetty now there is a lovely diving shed, and that's been constructed of wood. We use it as a classroom when school groups arrive on the island. And goods are now winched aboard from the Oldenburg onto the jetty, and that's how you get a Land Rover over onto Lundy Island. That's one of the Devon Fire and Rescue, Devon and Somerset now, fire and rescue vehicles as the fire engine. Work in progress for the road. It's an ongoing situation. It's the Forth Road Bridge. There we've got the lovely big long road down to the jetty along the cliffs there. But there's always maintenance to be done. There's always work to be done to restore it and keep it going in a fit manner. Restoration work is also still being undertaken. And here's a picture only a few years ago of, that's Rachel working on the chimney over at the battery on the west side of the island. And here we have Brazen Ward with the scaffolding put up. Rachel and her partner, Charlie, come across to do the restoring. Here we have on the right, Sir Anthony Gormley in the white trousers. And on the left is Derek Green, the island manager. And this is when Anthony Gormley's sculpture, Days 4, was erected on the island for a year, some years ago. And I think it's in Cambridge University. The Lundy Field Society play an important role in the life of Lundy. There on the right-hand side, I see Diana with the blue trousers with her hands on her thighs there, looking at the camera. And that's the lady there that passed away only last Tuesday. A few years ago, Lundy celebrated another anniversary. They celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Landmark Trust being formed in 1965. So in 2015, they wanted to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Landmark Trust. And there we have the Wicker Man being produced. Have you ever seen that film, The Wicker Man? I was invited to go back on Lundy for that celebration. I said, "Oh, what are you doing?" "Oh, we're building a Wicker Man." I said, "Oh, and I'm being invited, thank you." And they said, "Yeah, we're inviting you to take part in it." I said, "Why are you inviting me to take part in that?" "Well, because you're still serving in the police force." And we thought, a Wicker Man with a policeman inside. I said, "I'm not going to be stuck inside that, because that's what happened in that film, The Wicker Man in Scotland." So I never did go across for the party. And now, of course, Lundy is a very modern island with lots of youngsters in the employment there. But even this photograph, which was only taken about 4 years ago, gosh, some of the staff have changed. The warden, fifth from the left there with the binoculars around his neck, and his partner Zoe there with the lovely auburn hair. They've now just left Lundy Island, and the new warden a new assistant warden is arriving next Monday. And that's when I'm going across to Lundy next, and will help to introduce the new warden, assistant warden, hopefully, to the joys of Lundy Island. So the joys of Lundy Island are still there. We show children, school groups. Here they are in Jenny's Cove, where the puffins nest. I'm very passionate as well about accessibility for people on Lundy Island. And this lady here, Kate, she really is a very robust minded lady with her tramper vehicle, and she can get anywhere on Lundy. And so there's now 2 trampers on Lundy, which have been funded very generously through donations for people who are less able than we are blessed with to be able to enjoy Lundy Island. There we have a photograph which I wish I'd taken, but it's not my photograph. It came from a friend, of the Milky Way. Lundy Island also now has dark sky status and is one of those places so far away from light pollution that you can see the Milky Way just over your head, which is rather lovely. And of course, the wardens, there's Dean, who's just left very recently. He's one of the bird ringers working with the ornithology departments. He has assistants as well, counting the birds and the guillemots and those sorts of things. And really, it's time to sort of wind my chat down. At the very start of the talk, I mentioned about the generosity of Jack Hayward, didn't I? Jack Hayward died in 2015, and he wanted his ashes to be spread on Lundy Island. Below, in fact, Jack rowed at half-mast. I was very generously invited to go over for that very poignant ceremony for the benefactor of Lundy Island, who saved it from what could have been. But as a result of Jack Hayward's generosity, it was saved. It was given to the Landmark, the National Trust, who now lease it to the Landmark Trust. So really, I would say thank you very much, Jack Hayward. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for listening to my talk this afternoon. So I guess Mark will need to come back on, and I need to sort of stop sharing, I guess, Mark, in order that there may well be a few questions and things like that.
Yes, absolutely. If you want to stop sharing that would be great. Thank you so much, Simon. That was a fascinating pictorial journey through a place that I have visited all of one time in my life, but I have visited. In fact, I did some filming on Lundy years ago for something, and I also had to film on the boat on the way over, which for somebody who suffers with motion sickness is a really, really unpleasant job.
That's not nice looking down a camera.
No,
my goodness.
I've worked on better jobs in my time. That's very true.
I bet.
If you want to drop a question in the chat, if you would like me to ask it, please do. If you would like to ask a question yourself, please indicate by, I don't know, popping one of the little emoji hands on your screen or putting something in the chat or whatever. If you want to turn your camera on and your audio on and join us in the meeting, then please also do so at this point. Whilst people are doing that, I shall pass over to David, who I can see has his hand up for a question.
Hello, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Simon, very much indeed for that most interesting talk. Like Mark, I've only been to Lundy once, and we stayed at one of the Castle Cottage, Mary tells me.
Lovely.
Mary has been there twice, once as a young girl. I don't know about anybody else, but we suffered a little from the signal fading out every now and then. So
You've not got your camera on? No. Well, this is probably the light.
Sorry. Anyway, we suffered a bit from missing odd phrases here and there.
Ah, right.
But, one of the things that struck me most is that the Landmark Trust must have spent an absolute fortune there since they acquired it. I didn't realise quite as much work was done. And the other, sorry,
yes, you're absolutely right. They have spent, I think publicly they say £6 million, but I'm aware that that's a drop in the ocean of what they have spent. They have been very, very generous indeed.
Well, I don't know which the camera is.
The other thing I was going to say was, I don't think, but our Crediton Area History and Museum Society Secretary, Tim Sedgwick, he's not terribly keen to use Zoom and doesn't get much of a signal in the dip in Newton Sires where he lives. But he would say, if he was here, that he reckons his ancestors were smugglers who used Lundy Island. But that's obviously going back to the sort of 1600s, I think. And I believe there was quite a history of use of the island for smuggling, wasn't there, Simon? I don't know whether you can tell us anything about that.
Yeah,
but before I finish, I would like to say a very sincere thanks to Simon, because he, along with several others who were booked by the History Society to give actual talks at the Boniface Centre during the year of
6 months ago
lockdown, they have given these Zoom talks free of charge to enable us, in conjunction with the library, to put these talks on. So that was very generous and kind of you, Simon.
Welcome.
Most appreciative. Thanks very much.
Well, welcome indeed. David, yes, you're absolutely right. The smuggling history on Lundy really is absolutely rife. I guess at its height in the 1750s, when Thomas Benson was the MP for Barnstaple, and he had the contract to transport criminals for transportation to America prior to the War of Independence, of course. And so he used to set them off from Bristol and take them to Lundy Island. And he dumped them on Lundy Island. He leased Lundy Island. He turned them into basically what can only be described as a slave labor force. He kept them in a cave underneath the castle and hid them in there in case of the authorities arrived on Lundy. And he was a smuggler. And he met his end really because he got greedy, and the Nightingale scandal, a 5-masted huge brigantine. He insured up to the gunwales and had it sunk off Lundy. Naughty man. But yeah, smuggling was right, David.
Thank you.
I'm Amy. And can you hear me?
I can hear you, Amy, yes.
Yes. We stayed in the Castle Cottage only 6 months ago.
Lovely.
I often mentioned it. I mean, there's quite a lot of the castle is actually, you can hire it. And the Castle Cottage overlooks the landing stage.
It's got the best view on the island, hasn't it, Amy?
Absolutely.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you much indeed. I noticed that Jane Green has her hand raised.
Yes, indeed.
Would you care to ask your question, Jane? Don't forget to unmute yourself though, won't you? Well done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Just a couple of things, how I am associated with Lundy. One is, I think a relative may have been involved in that insurance scandal. My maiden name was Cobbledick, and I did research it at one stage.
Oops, a daisy.
And the other thing, my father worked at Fremington and he tested the amphibious vehicles. He was the trials officer. And in the family, we still make a cake today that we call Lundy cake, which was my grandma Cobbledick made it, convinced my father was going to starve when he was over on Lundy. And it's a fruit cake basically, but it's known in the family as Lundy cake. And, and the very good point was he was...
Shame you can't get the camera on.
He was a very good friend with Joan and John Dyke. And,
yes, yes.
Afterwards, when they lived at Saltram House for a bit as artist in residence, then down in Boscastle, he even went and babysat for their cat called Miss Pussy. They had strict instructions. They had to leave the electric light on the fire to make her think that the light was on in Saltram. I imagine Saltram was perhaps a bit chilly, so it fooled the cat.
Well done.
They were good family friends, and we all, I've been trying to think where mine is, but we all used to have paintings that, or water and colour that John had done.
Wasn't he talented? A wonderful, talented artist.
So yeah, sorry, that's just my association. But yes, I think when I traced back and found Paul had been to no good, I stopped tracing.
Yeah, there we are. Thanks much indeed for that, Jane.
Thank you.
Welcome indeed.
Thanks, Jane.
Any other questions, folks? Do feel free to pop your hand up, or yeah, Elizabeth. I can see Elizabeth.
Right.
Marian's hand.
Could I just ask what the power is? What sort of power you have there? Yeah. I stayed on Lundy in the 60s, and we had, that was my introduction to the wind pump.
Yes, it's not that wind pump blew down, but the power is now diesel generated. So diesel is taken over on the Oldenburg, pumped into the containers and tracted up the island. They have 3 generators on the island, the primary one and the secondary one, and an emergency one. And up until fairly recently, there was a former Royal Naval engineer running it, and those were run in a very ship-shape manner. But they're a bit state-of-the-art, sort of computer-driven, and when one cuts out, the other one can cut in, but very effective. The only complication with power really is if there's very bad weather and they cannot get the supply of diesel across to the island. Sometimes they get a bit tight with diesel, and they need to be quite economical with the electricity if needed.
They had a diesel there as well for emergencies, but it was switched off at 10 o'clock at night. Yeah,
the diesel generators even now are switched off at midnight and come back on again at 6 in the morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks very much. David, have you got another question, or is that a legacy hand on your screen?
It's Mary.
It's
okay.
Me. Yes, thank you. I've really enjoyed the talk because it's taken me back to when I was a teenager and went camping on Lundy and wrote to Mr. Gade and had a number of letters backwards and forwards about camping, I think, and staying. And a lot of them came, I found it fascinating because they said delayed by storm on the,
that's right.
And with little puffin stamps on. So that was quite romantic, really. And then
and still do. They still do.
Oh, right. Well, and then we camped by one of the quarries. We didn't camp on the field. We camped along the path, probably around the rhododendron area.
Right, right.
And stayed there. And that was my abiding memory of watching a basking shark from the top. It was wonderful, best view ever. Not seen another one since.
So they do come along that east side, which is lovely in the August period, and when it's nice and warm there. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah,
lovely.
Yeah. But it was, you know, we had an awful lot of, I thought he probably got rather annoyed with me writing backwards and forwards, but he must have been just about to leave. I think it was the Landmark Trust. And I also, we went out on a big boat and we came back on a small boat when it was dead calm. And the captain said his name was Davy Jones.
Ah, yes.
Which I used to think was a bit funny because Davy Jones' locker, you know. So we said, we hope that it's not, that we don't sink. But,
did you go back? Did you go back on the little Lundy Puffin?
We must have gone back on the Lundy Gannet because it was a small boat. We went.
Sorry, the Lundy Gannet. Mr. Jones was the captain of the Lundy Gannet in those days.
Ah, well, he was. That was his real name then.
Yes, and he was. I've got an idea. He was on the Clovelly lifeboat as well, lifeboat crew.
Oh, oh.
And I think his son, or was it his father, was also running the Lundy Gannet as well. So that was what a lovely story. Thank you for sharing that, Mary.
Okay.
Thanks, Mary. I wonder, Simon, actually, from what David was saying earlier about smuggling and the fact that Lundy is an ideal place to be involved in something like that in the past, obviously.
Beautifully situated, yes.
Absolutely. And something that I've been writing about for the book that I'm currently writing, because I write and research about folklore and associated topics. And there's a lot of connection between traditional ghost stories and legends and smuggling, because one leads to the other and vice versa the other way, actually. So I wonder whether there are any connections on the island between smuggling and any of the stories or legends that are based there.
I would say yes. You have got on Lundy piracy, of course, which involves smuggling, and you had Salkeld, a great pirate, Salkeld, off the North Devon coast in I'm trying to say 1609, something like that. And on
Which did you say was your camera?
In the east side of Lundy Island, you've got three places. One is Gannet's Combe, which was named after Gallows Combe. One is Tibet's, which was named after Gibbets. And one is Hangman's Hill, which is where the flag is, where Jack Hayward's ashes are spread. And so you've got three centres there, along there, that it is suggested, and the folklore of Lundy say that Salkeld, really, he took prisoners, he took slaves from the north coast of Devon and Cornwall, he put them on Lundy Island, and they were kept in three separate areas, and there were places of execution for them if they didn't toe the line. And so there's a bit of some truth about, yes, Salkeld did exist, he was smuggling, he was committing piracy, but there's the legend as well where these names came from. So legend, myth, history, stories, it's all caught up, isn't it?
Yeah.
And at the moment I'm researching a book which it loosely described is like a horrible history of Lundy Island. So it's Lundy's, what should I say, Lundy's peculiar past of myth and legend. So I'm hoping to put that together next year.
Excellent, thank you. There's a text question from Chris and Anne. I'll come to you in a second, then Tony after that one. There's a question from Chris and Anne in the chat. How many puffins on Lundy now, and are they making a comeback?
What a great question. Thank you very much indeed, you two, for that question. Last year, in 2020, the warden, obviously during lockdown, they were still there living. They counted about 540, I think it was. This year, they've just collated their figures, 848. That is an amazing amount when you consider that in 2002, there were 6. So that is a massive difference. And the reason for that is because of the rat eradication program, which was put into place over 7 years to get rid of the rats. The rats have now been eradicated. The land is checked frequently, in case of any rats returning. But the ground nesting birds, like the puffins and the Manx shearwaters, to a degree the storm petrels, but not significantly, have really taken off. Excuse the pun. But yes, puffins are now up in the many hundreds. Great news.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that question. There is another text one, which I'll come to in just a moment. Tony was next with his hand up, though. Whilst I go and mute myself and let my scratching cat in the door of the office, Tony, please do ask your question.
Well done. Cats have their place. Well done. Tony, hello.
Thank you. Hi, Simon. Thank you. Thank you for that talk. I remember when I was a kid, I used to have a coin, which was a Lundy penny.
Correct.
I can remember it said on the front, Martin Coles Harman.
There we are.
He had it, an image rather like the monarch's image on the front of the coin, and on the back it said one puffin.
You are absolutely correct. They are sought after collectible items. I've got a puffin and a half puffin in my little collection. He was very, very naughty. Martin Coles Harman in 1929 decided to create the Lundy stamps, and that's okay. And this Lundy stamps, they actually represent the oldest private postal system in the world. They're still running, of course, and they are one of the major income generators for Lundy Island, which is lovely. He also, at the same time, contrary to the 1874 Counterfeit Currency Act, went and minted coins. Now, many of us here, I'm sure, will be old enough to remember the pennies and the halfpennies. And on the pennies and the halfpennies, we would have the sovereign's head. He stuck his own head on the front, which was naughty. And on the obverse of the coin, on the old halfpennies, if you remember, there used to be a ship, didn't there? There was a ship. Instead of that, there was a puffin, and around it, half puffin. On the full puffin coin, as you correctly allude to, wasn't a picture of Britannia with Eddystone Lighthouse down the bottom. There was a picture of a puffin. It was a puffin. And so he was prosecuted. He was prosecuted and he went to the High Court. He contested it just as a matter of principle, because he jolly well was the King of Lundy and no one criticised him. And he contested it, and he was fined 21 guineas for the temerity of contravening the Counterfeit Currency Act. Tony, you're absolutely right. It's a correct memory. 1929. Naughty old Mr. Harman, eh?
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thanks, Tony. There's another question in the chat, which I can see the relevance of this question, seeing as it's been written by Helena Sykes, who says, do you know why the church is sometimes known as St. Helena and sometimes St. Helen? There is a statue inside to St. Helena.
She's absolutely correct. On Lundy Island, there was an ancient chapel dedicated to St. Ellen, a very ancient early Christian chapel. And St. Ellen was one of our early Christian saints. When Grusset Hudson Heaven decided to build that church, he had a statue of St. Helena created, and it's above the front door with Sancta Helena underneath it. So that's why people sometimes erroneously refer to the church as dedicated to Saint Helena. St. Helena is just simply an interpretation of the word St. Helen, which is a derivative of St. Ellen. So officially, within the Exeter Diocese, it is the parish church of St. Helen. It was extra parochial until a few years ago. We used to be under the parish over the team ministry over at Hartland and Clovelly. Now it's its own parish with a team minister, and she comes across from the mainland on the last weekend of every month to stay in the vestry, which has been beautifully restored, to hold ecumenical services. So yes, your inquiry is quite right. There's always a little bit of discrepancy, but the official version is the statue is dedicated to Sancta Helena, and the church is the Church of St. Helens, according to the diocese. I hope that explains that one.
Marvellous, thank you very much. That is the end of the questions of which I have knowledge. If you have any questions that you have not indicated, there is just a brief moment to do so now. Otherwise, I shall wrap up in just a second.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. In just a moment, I will let people know what is going to be happening next month. But in the meantime, whilst I stop this recording, do please all show your appreciation in the chat or on the screen or wherever you wish to do so to Simon for that fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that kind word, Mark. And thank you everybody for
Thank you very much.
sharing my afternoon and my love of Lundy Island. I'll pass your best wishes on Monday when I arrive there for the week.
Thank you.
Thank you for the thumbs up. That's very kind of you.